Forgiveness, what is it and why Alaska needs it? That is what we're talking about today in this episode of Tell Your Story, Alaska. Can you forgive someone who hurt you and has no remorse? Can you forgive someone who hurt you and doesn't even know it? Does forgiveness mean to let someone off the hook? Does forgiveness mean abusers just get away with it? What did Jesus mean by forgive 70 times 7? Are we to just brush off what an abuser did to us? And does that mean he just gets away with it? If you find yourself overwhelmed by bitterness and anger towards people who hurt you, or took advantage of you, or betrayed you, how can you find freedom from it? That is what we're going to talk about today in this episode on forgiveness. Here we go. This is Tell Your Story, Alaska. We talk aviation, history, theology, but most of all, the raw stories of Alaskans and the gospel. 1 Corinthians 13:5 says, "Love does not count up wrongdoing," or as some translations say, "Love is not resentful." But how can we not count wrongdoing against us when there's so much damage done to us? And yet, this is how it describes love, is not counting those things up. So how do we do that? I think this is a really key thing that Alaska needs today. Alaska is just rife with generational sins, which means that a parent is wounded, and that wound manifests itself in wounding his children, and those children grow up with wounds, and on it goes. So how do you break this cycle? How do you handle issues when someone who's done injustice against you is not fair? It shouldn't have happened to you, but it did. The answer is forgiveness. So we are going to take a look at forgiveness today. We're going to debunk some of the misconceptions about forgiveness, and we're going to talk about how to forgiveness. Because if you are simmering in bitterness and some kind of a wound that has created some fear in you, that has created a high level of anger, even a low level of anger in you that you just live with, we're going to talk about the antidote, which is forgiveness. And we're going to define forgiveness. It's maybe a bit surprising of what forgiveness is. So let's start with talking about Alaska. Over half of Alaska's homes do not have both parents present. Many homes where both parents are present, there's a lot of dysfunction going on. I'm not just harping on Alaska. This is kind of a worldwide thing. Parentless homes are really becoming more and more common, especially in the United States. I guess I can't speak for the rest of the world. But because this is a podcast about Alaska, I do want to focus on Alaska. The data shows that Alaska has the highest suicide rate in the country. So per capita, the number of suicides happen, we have the highest rate in our state of Alaska. And I do believe that unforgiveness is a huge reason why there is such a high rate of suicide. Of course, it's more complex than that. But I do think forgiveness is an antidote that would bring that rate vastly down, is the simple idea of forgiveness. Now, you probably know someone who's committed suicide. I do know a few. Also, some of the other manifestations of unforgiveness, which means you are a person full of bitterness, is to numb those feelings with drugs, alcohol, or other forms of abuse, or other forms of coping mechanisms to deal with the issues in your life. And the coping mechanisms, obviously, they don't solve the problems, they perpetuate them. The way it is actually solved is forgiveness. And so it's important that we understand a clear meaning of what forgiveness means and what it doesn't mean. So I want to start with some misconceptions about what forgiveness is not. These are really important because understanding what forgiveness isn't helps us to understand what it is. There are a lot of misconceptions out there that have really ruined forgiveness for a lot of people. Like, that doesn't make sense to me. I don't want to do that. Now, let me give you one example. Here's the first misconception. Forgive and forget. You've probably heard this phrase before. I've mentioned this in the other podcast called We Need Fathers, so you can listen to that. But the idea of forgive and forget falsely identifies what forgiveness is. And this is so common, this idea of just forget about it, forgiving and forgetting. It's such a abuse of what real forgiveness is. It's really sad that we don't want to pursue forgiveness because we think this is what it is. What is usually meant by forget is to bottle it up and do your best to just pretend it never happened. This is actually probably the worst thing you can do because it leads to a stunted growth in the area that you are wounded. So whatever happened to you, you're being told, well, forgive and forget. You can't forget. The reality is you're not going to forget it. What you're going to do is bottle it up. You're going to do your best to put it out of your mind. You're going to distract yourself with other things. This is not forgiveness. And someone says forgive and forget. There's a part of you that does not want to forget. There's a part of you that wants to remain in your anger. There's a part of you that wants vengeance. There's a part of you that wants to see the other person who hurt you. You want to see them suffer. This is not forgiveness because forgetting is not going to happen. That's just not realistic. But what we want to see happen with real forgiveness is remembering. In a lot of cases, the opposite is the truth. We want to remember, but we're going to remember what happened in a new, free, and healed way. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. So, misconception number 1, forgive and forget, not what forgiveness means. Forgiveness is much more radical and more shocking than you might realize. Okay, another misconception is that forgiveness means I immediately trust the person who hurt me. It means trust is restored. This is not the case at all. Forgiveness and restored trust are two different things. You can forgive someone and never trust them ever again. That can be a thing. Now, ideally, we want forgiveness and a restored trust to happen. But forgiveness must happen first, and then we want trust to be restored over time. But these are two separate events. So forgiveness does not mean that trust is restored. In many cases, when forgiveness happens, there needs to be a boundary and you actually never see that person again. That is also possible. So forgiveness does not mean that trust is restored. This is false. So we want to separate those two concepts. Okay, a third misconception is that forgiveness means the perpetrator just gets away with it. So a lot of times we don't want to forgive because that means I don't get my vengeance. That means justice can't happen. This is false. Justice and forgiveness go hand in hand. And we're going to talk about what I mean by that in this episode. So one example of this is in Exodus chapter 34, verses 6 and 7. God is describing here one of his attributes, or a couple of them that are put together that are a bit puzzling. And here are the two. He says that he forgives wickedness, rebellion, and sin, yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He forgives wickedness, rebellion, and sin, yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. How can it be that you forgive sin, but yet you punish the guilty? Like, both are happening here. This is actually a puzzling verse. Like, how do you put these together? The reason we're puzzled by this is because of our misunderstanding of forgiveness. So the answer here is the cross. The guilty were punished. They were just punished on the cross. The guilt was put on Christ, not on the person who perpetuated the sin, which is us. So the guilty, you and I, our punishment was put on the cross. And this is our sins against God. Let's translate that to someone who sins against you. This is a different thing. How are we to translate this to how we react to forgiveness? If God paid our penalty, What are we to pay for the perpetrator? The answer is a bit shocking. So we're going to go into that today. And those are the 3 misconceptions about forgiveness. Forgive and forget. Nope. Forgiveness means trust is restored. No. And forgiveness means the perpetrator gets away with it. No. We are going to talk about what forgiveness actually is today. And what forgiveness is actually shocking to me. So here we go. So let's start this sort of thought journey with Jesus's teachings. Matthew 18, starting in verse 23. The context here is the disciples had just asked Jesus, how many times should we forgive someone who, does something against us? And he says, not just 7 times, but 70 times 7. And then Jesus tells this parable. So here it is. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his servants. When he began to settle, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. Just a note, 10,000 talents is a massive number. It's an unpayable debt. 1 talent is about 20 years worth of labor. And so 10,000 talents is obviously a totally unpayable debt. So the servant has an unpayable debt. Verse 25, and since he could not pay, his master ordered him to be sold with his wife and children and all that he had, and payment to be made. So the servant fell on his knees, imploring him, have patience with me, I will pay you everything. And out of pity for him, the master, that servant, released him and forgave him the debt. But when that same servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. Now, 1 denarii is about 1 day's labor. So he's talking about 100 days of labor owed, which is a lot, but not nearly 10,000 talents. So one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii, and seizing him, he began to choke him, saying, pay what you owe. So his fellow servant fell down and pleaded with him, have patience with me, and I will pay you. He refused and went to put him in prison until he should pay the debt. When his fellow servants saw what had taken place, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their master all that had taken place. Then his master summoned him and said to him, you wicked servant, I forgave you all the debt because you pleaded with me. And should not you have had mercy on your fellow servant as I had mercy on you? And in anger his master delivered him to the jailers until he should pay all his debt. So also will my heavenly Father do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother from your heart. That last line is actually the scariest one of them all. If we are unable to forgive people who hurt us, remember, these are things that aren't fair. It's something that happened to us. It's unjust. And yet if we cannot extend forgiveness, he is saying your Father will not forgive you. Now, what I see here is we have a master forgiving 10,000 talents, an absolute unpayable debt. This is identifiable with our debt of our breaking of the moral law, our own sins. When we sin, it incurs a debt against God, and that was paid for on the cross. We don't have to do anything. We simply receive. The debt was paid for us. That's like the 10,000 talents that the servant was relieved of that debt. We have been relieved of this debt. And then when someone had a debt against the servant, and it was a much lesser debt, he refused to forgive it. This is kind of a shocking and radical version of forgiveness that we're talking about. There's a vertical element that we have received massive forgiveness, a massive amount of debt that we are unable to pay has been forgiven us. And that is why we ought to be able to extend forgiveness to others. So there's a vertical element here, and then there's a horizontal element. The horizontal element is the part of you that someone did something to you, an injustice against you. It hurt you, has wounded you. You're now in pain. You've been damaged by this thing. How do we extend forgiveness? That's what we're going to go into today, step by step. So pay close attention. Now, the following 4 steps I pulled from a book called Forgive by Timothy Keller, and he does a good job of clarifying what forgiveness is and what it isn't. And so I'd like to go through these 4 steps, and
I get a little bit skeptical when I hear 4 steps to success or 4 steps to make your life better. And so I don't want you to think of it as that sort of thing, but just as a guideline to bring clarity to what we're pursuing. And a step-by-step process can be helpful, especially when you are in a wounded state, like you are swimming in anger and bitterness. There is a strong temptation to remain in that anger and bitterness. There's almost like a pleasure in it, in just festering in your bitterness. But what you may not see is that your bitterness is going to bleed out to the people close to you. And this is what we were talking about earlier, is generational sins. I want to see you free. I want to see you free of your bitterness, living rather than in festering in bitterness. You are festering and living in freedom, in light, in joy and delight, because that sort of thing is going to spread to others rather than your bitterness. Now, step 1, I'm just going to name the 4 steps and then we'll go through them, okay? Step 1 is name the trespass. Number 2, identify with the perpetrator. Step 3, absorb the debt. Step 4, aim for reconciliation. Now, step 3 is probably the hardest part, but we're going to talk about that. But let's start with number 1, name the trespass. What happened to you? Name specifically the action or the words, or maybe the non-action. It could have been something that was done over many years, sort of a passive-aggressive thing, or maybe it was one specific instance. Either way, do your best to identify what it was. Say it in a sentence. I was abused. This was said to me, or I was raised in this way. Do your best to concisely identify what the trespass was. The thing that is spurring in you anger over some injustice that happened to you. Do your best to say it plainly. Okay, number 2 is identify with the perpetrator. This one's really interesting because it's a bit counterintuitive. We don't want to identify with the perpetrator. We want to see the perpetrator suffer. We want to see him in jail. We want to see some kind of justice happen. But what forgiveness is calling for is for you to identify with the perpetrator. Recognize that he is steeped in unforgiveness himself. He is the recipient of some wound that has made him angry, that has made him abusive, that has made him steeped in bitterness, and he has lashed out against you. This is the very thing that you are trying to free yourself from. He is, or she is, completely steeped in it. He's controlled by it. He's swimming in anger and bitterness. And that's why something has leaked out onto you. So recognize that there is some sin or some wound in his life that has caused this. He is a sinful person like you are. He is deeply wounded just like you are. But yet he has not found forgiveness like you are trying to find. Identify with the perpetrator. Now, here's a quote from Timothy Keller's book on how to identify with the perpetrator. He says, quote, "Think of the perpetrator not just as a villain, but as a human being with his own fears and griefs." Okay. Now, number 3 is a very difficult one. It means absorb the debt. Absorb the debt. Now, let's say, for example, I stole someone's truck. I steal someone's truck and I drive it and I crash it and total the truck. Now I go to the person I stole it from and said, "I stole your truck. I'm sorry." If that person says, "I forgive you," that person has absorbed the debt. He's not going to count it against me. In other words, he has to pay the cost of what I did. This is a really hard one to swallow, is to identify what you lost. Maybe you lost your innocence. Maybe you lost some kind of a purity. Maybe you were degraded in some way, and so you feel lesser than you would have otherwise. Maybe you have a memory that you can't erase, so you have to relive something in your mind over and over and over again. Maybe now you have a fear that you wouldn't have had otherwise. So what we want to do here is do your best to identify what it is you have lost and accept that you have lost it. You have been damaged somehow, and it wasn't your fault. Something happened to you. It was an injustice against you. Forgiveness requires that we absorb the debt. In order for me to be forgiven for destroying the other man's truck, forgiveness means he has forgiven me of that debt. He absorbs the debt. He takes the loss. There's a quote here from Timothy Keller. It says, "Absorbing the debt is giving up your right to pay back the person for what they did to you." Now, forgiveness allows you to begin healing because you've accepted the damage done to you. It frees you from your perpetrator's power over you. It matures your character in ways only possible by this painful process. And it breaks the cycle of generational sins that may have been going on for many, many generations. And in order for all this to happen, you must absorb the debt. You must take the damage. It's only when you accept the damage is when you can begin healing from it. When you're steeped in bitterness, you don't heal. You continue to hold that wound open and it won't heal. But when you accept that you have been damaged, you've lost something. That person who did something to you has taken something from you. A debt has happened, and you must absorb that debt. When you do that, you can begin healing from it. It won't be easy at first. It will be a wound, but that wound will eventually become a scab, and a scab will become a scar. Now, we know about scars. All of us have them. I have some scars on my skin, and I like showing them off because when you have a scar, it's something that's healed. It doesn't bother you anymore. You can see it there. You have a memory of why it's there, but it no longer affects you in your day-to-day life. And at times, you can even show your friends, hey, look at this scar. I got it from, playing football, or I had this injury back in the day, and now it's healed, and now I have a story to tell you. This is the beautiful thing about accepting the damage, is that your damage, your wound, will become a scar, not right away, but in time. You will begin the process of turning it into a scar, and when it's a scar, it becomes like a medal. It becomes the sign on you of your maturity, of your growth, of your forgiveness. You can show others that, and it is now a life-giving thing and not a life-stealing thing. And that is the beauty of scars. Other people will see your scars and identify with it, and they can turn their wounds into scars because they saw how you did it. This requires absorbing the debt and beginning that healing process. I think this is probably the hardest one. The next hardest one might be identify with the perpetrator, but absorbing the debt is a hard one to swallow because it doesn't feel fair. Okay, step 4 is aim for reconciliation. Now, the wording is intentional here. It says aim for reconciliation. It says aim for it because it's not always going to happen. Reconciliation requires some action on your perpetrator, the person who hurt you. If your perpetrator, the other person, repents and shows sorrow, you can begin reconciliation, but it's a slow process. We said it already that forgiveness does not mean that trust is immediately restored. Restored trust and forgiveness are two different events. And so if the other person repents, you can begin that process of restoring trust. But it takes time. It can take a long time, and it should do it in baby steps. You've accepted damage from that person, and extending trust is a very different thing. Now, if the person is not aware of what they did to you, or if they're just not sorry, they just don't care, they're not repentant, their hearts are hardened, then healthy boundaries are going to be required. You need to have space between you and that person, and every situation is going to be different, but you need to find a way to find space between you and that person if they are not aware of their hurt towards you, or if they're just simply not repentant. Then forgiveness can happen. You're going to absorb the debt and you're going to begin healing from it, but you also are going to have boundaries with that person. Okay, so those are the 4 steps, okay? These are like if you are seeking forgiveness, and what is it? Those are the 4 steps. The key one there for me, and the shocking one to me, is absorbing the debt. It's not forgetting about it. It's not bottling up. It's I'm accepting the damage done to me, and it's going to take time for me to heal from it. I think that's the hardest one. Now, let's talk about what happens when you don't forgive, when you continue in unforgiveness. In Timothy Keller's book, there's a priest named Henry Nouwen. He put it this way, and I really like the way he said it. He said, quote, "By not forgiving, I chain myself to a desire to get even, thereby losing my freedom. Thereby losing my freedom. You become enslaved to your own bitterness, your desire for vengeance. This will be a marker of your life, and you are enslaving yourself to this thing. I want you to be free. I want you to break a generational sin that's been going on. If you seek to satisfy your anger, it will serve only to harden your heart and make you more capable of hurting people close to you in the future. This also allows the perpetrator to continue to have some control over you. Even if he's in jail or he's dead or he's far away, he has some control over you as long as you remain in unforgiveness." Now, I just want to point out, like for me personally, one thing that really helped me was step 2, which is identify with the perpetrator. Identify with the perpetrator. This was really key for me in finding forgiveness towards other people, because when I recognize that they are wounded people themselves, sometimes wounds makes them unaware that they have hurt other people. Sometimes it's their pride that has blinded them. They don't realize that they have hurt others. Or maybe they are aware and they're just not sorry. But what really helps me is that they live in a tiny little box and they're enslaved by their own sin. Whether they see it or not, they are enslaved. Being enslaved by sin is really tragic. It's very, very sad. Now, when I look at that person, I'm going to identify with that perpetrator, lost in sin, enslaved to sin. What a sad state that they are in. I know compassion is not what you're naturally going to feel towards your perpetrator, but I gotta say, it really, really helps me to say that person is lost in sin. An unrepentant person or a person who does not know that he hurt someone is lost. There's something really sad about that. And for me, that helped me tremendously to find healing from it. I have freedom from that person. What that person now thinks of me, or whatever power that person has over me, is now totally diffused because of the sad condition that they are in, enslaved by a wound, by a sin, by pride, something like that. They are lost over in that world. I am now finding freedom from that world, and that has just given me a perspective that frees me from the people who hurt me. And so really the identifying with the perpetrator for me was vastly important to say, I am now free of that person. That person no longer lives rent-free in my brain. If I ever see these people or that person or these people, it doesn't bother me anymore. I have found freedom. So identifying with the perpetrator personally for me was a really good one. Absorbing the debt was easier for me in some of my forgiving situations. But I think I can see how that could be a lot harder for others, absorbing the debt and then healing from it. Now, as long as you remain in this state of bitterness and unforgiveness, the perpetrator will maintain power over you as long as you don't forgive. In some cases, if they're especially egregious people, they know it. They realize the power they have over you, and they will enjoy that power. They know how to trigger you, and they will do it intentionally because it brings them pleasure. They see the power they have. Just with a look in your direction, they can see you cower. They have power over you. But yet, by forgiving them, you rob them of this power. You absorb the damage. You begin healing from it. You identify with the perpetrator, as I've already described, and you find yourself free of them. The next time they give you that look, you are free of it. So by forgiving them, you actually are robbing them of power that they have over you. So let's ask the question, does forgiving mean justice is not going to happen? If something criminal has happened, for example, if I forgive them, does that mean I don't turn them into the authorities? The answer is no. You can forgive someone and turn them into the authorities. Now, there's a couple of kinds of justice here. There's authoritative justice and there's personal justice. Personal justice, we could also call it vengeance. In Deuteronomy, I forget the verse right now, but Jesus or the scriptures say, "Vengeance is mine, says the Lord." Vengeance is mine. Vengeance is not for us to take. There's very important reasons for this. We are to trust that God is sovereign and He is just and He will bring ultimate justice. Now, there are authorities here on earth. We have a court system, we have police, and you should turn in someone who's done something criminally against you. You should call the police, and you can also forgive them. The two can happen at the same time. Because remember, forgiving means you are absorbing the debt. You've accepted damage that's happened to you, and you're going to begin healing. You should also protect other people by calling in the police or whatever is the appropriate authority, so he won't do it again. Now, we recognize that our court system, our justice system in America, while I do think it's pretty good, it's extremely imperfect. There's a lot of problems and injustices that happen. And so what if you're a perpetrator, you've called the police, you've gone through a court and a trial, and they the end result is they're free. Like they don't have to face the consequences you were hoping they would have to face. This is the result of an imperfect justice system here on earth. We shouldn't have the expectation of perfect justice in this life. Although it is wonderful when it does happen through our systems of justice, it won't always happen. So how do we handle that? God is sovereign. He will judge all things perfectly in the end. Your perpetrator, if he went through the justice system and he's walking free today, he will face a judgment. He'll have to stand before God and make his case before God, who will dish out justice perfectly. This is something you have to trust will happen. You have to trust that it will happen. That is the way you can find freedom, and you can actually change your bitterness towards that person to compassion. That guy has to face the judgment seat, and he doesn't even know it. He doesn't know it's coming to him, but he's not going to like it when it comes. This changes your heart from bitterness to compassion if you believe that. And you find freedom from it, which is the part, of course, the best part. You find freedom because you are trusting in the Lord's ultimate justice. So in this imperfect system of justice that we have here, yes, utilize those, but even if justice doesn't happen in those cases, you do have a God above who is sovereign, who will ultimately bring it. And you can set, boundaries, keep your distance, things like that. In some rare cases, you need to get the police involved with, what do you call those, restraining orders or whatever. So anyway, all of those things will lead to you having freedom in your heart. Your soul tie to that person can be severed, and you can live your life without that person's power over you. Okay, so what about, say, a young person who is told to be kept quiet by some threat? So the threat might be, if you tell anyone, I will hurt your brother. Your perpetrator might say something like that, a threat. If you do this, I will hurt so-and-so. That is a really tough situation, especially for a young person. But I would just say that a powerful truth here is that by resisting that threat, by telling someone, you are protecting others more securely than if you didn't tell. You should not give in to the threat.
That is the thing that's keeping his unjust actions going. His threat is keeping his injustice and continued wounding of people going. So I would say you must take the risk of his threat by telling someone, especially the authorities. Make that phone call, whatever. So those types of things are probably some of the most difficult situations, and they are risky situations because you don't know how exactly to respond to your threat. But if you do nothing, the abuse will continue, and also nothing is stopping him from doing the thing he's threatening to do. There's nothing stopping him. And so you must take that risk, in my opinion. All right, I want to kind of shift gears here and talk about this idea again of generational sins. So a father is wounded somehow, but his father, he grows up, is living in bitterness and has anger issues, and that manifests itself in wounding people close to him. And those people become wounded and they end up wounding others, so we get this perpetuality to these wounds. And so a good example of this is in the book of Genesis. Now, we got Isaac and Rebekah. Isaac is Abraham's son, and Isaac marries Rebekah. Now, Isaac showed favoritism towards Esau, but Rebekah showed favoritism towards Jacob, and she worked up this scheme so that Jacob would get the blessing rather than his brother Esau. The scheme worked, and Jacob stole the blessing. Now, Jacob grows up, and he marries Rachel and Leah. Jacob shows favoritism towards Rachel. This led Leah to do some manipulating. You can read the details of that. But then he has a lot of kids, and he ends up showing favoritism towards Rachel's kids, one of which is Joseph, his youngest at the time. He showed favoritism towards Joseph. This gave Joseph a puffed up sense of self. When Joseph had these dreams about him ruling over his brothers, he kind of shoved it in their face. Hey, I had this dream. I'm going to rule over you. This, of course, makes the brothers angry. Now, the brothers ended up betraying Joseph. They were going to kill him. Then they changed their mind, and it ended up selling him into slavery. They knew how much this would devastate their father, so they lied, and they said, we didn't sell him to slavery. He was killed by a wild animal. And so here we have deception. They cause pain to their father. And so we see the perpetuation of pain and wounds here because of a generational sin. Now, how is this pattern broken? Eventually, Joseph forgave his brothers. He became a powerful ruler in Egypt, second to Pharaoh, and the brothers were coming to get food because there was a terrible famine. And it's a complex story, but Joseph ended up forgiving his brothers when they came for the food. And he told the brothers, because they were afraid of retribution, but he told them, hey brothers, you intended harm to me, but God intended it for good. So we see here that even in our sin, God is preparing something beautiful. The beautiful thing was not possible unless this process of repeated wounds followed by forgiveness could happen. We could see that God's love, his forgiveness, and his attributes were put up on a pedestal for us to see, but we had to go through this painful process, which brought in the end more maturity, more delight, more beauty. And that was all done because of this forgiveness. So what I want to show here is that forgiveness breaks the chain of generational sins. But forgiveness, it's hard. It's easy to continue on in our bitterness. It's hard to identify the trespass, to identify with the perpetrators. If you think about these steps, what Joseph did, absorb the debt and then aim for reconciliation. This is very hard and easy to stay in bitterness. Now, this is an interesting point here is that Joseph told his brothers, you meant it for evil. He did not say, oh, it wasn't so bad. Like what you did really wasn't that bad. He didn't say that. He actually calls it evil. You meant it for evil. You were trying to do something horrible. And notice what they were doing was responding to their own wounds, their own festering bitternesses that just exploded in what they did to their brother. And he says, what you did
was evil. He did not whitewash it. He called it evil. But then he said, but God meant it for good. Sin in the world leads to God showing his attributes to us in this world. And I think that's part of the point. Joseph recognized that forgiveness is possible because God is sovereign. Joseph's reality was driven by God's grace and not by his own lingering bitternesses. So staying in your bitterness is an indulgence, but yet pursuing forgiveness takes more work, but there is more life, more beauty in that. Now, just a real life example of that is over in Papua, over in Indonesia. I've heard quite a few stories. I was trying to find a specific one. I was unable to find one, but I am told there's many of these. Many of the tribes there have been really untouched for millennia. I even did a little research into their genetic history, which was super interesting, that they have been there on those islands for a few thousand years at least, which is a really long time, and they've been there largely untouched. And what has been happening for all of that time is a series of cyclical revenge. So, maybe 1,000 years ago or whatever, some guy murdered another guy. People from his tribe want to get revenge, and they start murdering each other. And it's this cycle of revenge. You may have heard of this from, the Jim Elliot story. There's something similar happening there with the native people stuck in a perpetual series of revenges. And even their life expectancy, I think, was, not even all that old because they keep dying from spearing each other. How was that broken? Well, missionaries end up going in. The missionaries spent years learning the languages. They phonetically wrote down letters to connect the sounds to words, and they taught literacy. And they turned that literacy training into Bible teaching, and they told the biblical stories, one like Joseph's story, where a generational cycle of sin was broken by forgiveness. These tribes' capability of forgiving each other has led, for some of them, was cannibalistic in nature, this cycle of revenge. If you imagine these two tribes, a valley apart from each other, have been warring for generations upon generations, has now come to an end. And rather than spearing each other, they're marrying each other. But that required forgiveness. It required a breaking of this cycle. It required them saying, we have lost a massive amount because of these wounds that we've received from the other tribe. We're going to absorb that debt and we're going to heal from it. And eventually trust was restored. They were able to marry each other. This is the core message of the gospel. It is unmerited reception of forgiveness. We have received this from God just by his grace, not by our own merit. He paid the debt of our sins on the cross. And now we have the capability. It's because of what he did, we're able to extend that to others and absorb that debt, and he will provide healing from us. Now, here's another real life example. My wife just finished reading The Hiding Place by Corrie ten Boom. It's a very famous story, and she was famous for hiding Jews in her home to save them from the Holocaust, from the Nazis. Now, she ended up getting caught, and she went to Ravensbrück concentration camp, where her sister Betsy died, but Corrie ten Boom survived the camp. After the war, in 1947, Corrie went to Germany on a speaking tour to speak on the gospel. In her speech, she said, God has thrown our sins into the bottom of the sea. And after she finished speaking, a man approached her, and she recognized the man. She said, this man had been a guard at Ravensbrück concentration camp where we were sent. It came back with a rush. The huge room with its harsh overhead lights, the pathetic pile of dresses and shoes in the center of the floor, the shame of walking naked past this man. I could see my sister's frail form ahead of me, ribs sharp beneath her apartment skin. Betsy, how thin you were. I remembered the leather crop swinging from his belt. Now he was in front of me, his hand thrust out.
A fine message, Fräulein. How good it is to know that, as you say, all our sins are at the bottom of the sea. Now he did not recognize her, but she recognized him. This was the first time she had met any of her former captors, so she said. The woman who had just given a speech about God's forgiveness kept her hand in her pocket. He went on to tell her he had been a guard at Ravensbrück, and he had turned to Christ, and he had sought forgiveness for all the cruel things he had done there. Corrie didn't move. I stood there, she recounted, I whose sins had every day to be forgiven, and I could not. Betsy had died in that place. Could he erase her slow, terrible death simply by asking? With his hand thrust out, Corrie stood unmoving. But Corrie had seen many people in post-World War II who could not forgive, and in their bitterness remained invalids. She also knew that forgiveness is not an emotion, it is an act of the will. Silently, she prayed, Jesus, help me. I can lift my hand, I can do that much. And so woodenly, mechanically, I thrust my hand into the one stretched out to me, and as I did, an incredible thing took place. The current started in my shoulder, raced down my arm, sprang into our joined hands, and then this healing warmth seemed to flood my whole being, bringing tears to my eyes. I forgive you, brother, I cried with all my heart. I have never known God's love so intensely as I did then. Now that is an incredible story of forgiveness happening kind of instantaneously. This would be what you might call miraculous. This was not a normal case. I think normally forgiveness takes place over some time of sorting out in your mind what it means to absorb the debt and to extend forgiveness. But in Corrie ten Boom's story here, she was able to extend it immediately. And hopefully that happens for you as well. But I wouldn't expect it to. Expect it to be a process. Hebrews 12:15 says, See to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and by it many become defiled. See how the bitterness spreads to other people. Wounds perpetuate wounds, but forgiveness perpetuates forgiveness, and that's the harder thing. That's why there's so much brokenness in the world. This is why Alaska needs forgiveness so desperately. This is why Alaska needs the gospel so desperately. It's the ultimate version of forgiveness that all of us need to receive, and also gives us the capability to extend. A couple of quotes from Tim Keller. He says, Forgiveness then is a form of voluntary suffering. In forgiving rather than retaliating, you make a choice to bear the cost. Forgiveness means that when you want to make them suffer, instead you refuse to do it. And this refusal is hard. It is difficult and costly, but through it you are absorbing the debt yourself. Some think that by remaining angry, they are giving the wrongdoers what they deserve, but in reality, you are enabling their actions to continue to hurt you. All right, guys, I hope that was a helpful summary of forgiveness. This was a really neat learning experience for me studying this topic, and also shocking for me to learning what forgiveness was and what it wasn't, and debunking a lot of the misconceptions and these misconceptions have caused all kinds of damage. It has caused people to not pursue forgiveness because they misunderstood what it was. So I hope that was helpful for you, and it hopes to set you on a path towards freedom, towards forgiveness, towards being full of delight and joy rather than bitterness and anger. Thanks, guys, and we will talk to you next time.